The temperature had dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit when the first neighbors lost their stoves. Not the fire, not the wood. The stoves themselves, cast iron cracked by thermal shock, flue pipes sealed shut by ice. Cabins that had stood for 20 years buckled under the weight of that January. Log walls went cold in hours. Sod roofs caved. 3 families on the eastern ridge moved into the church before the second week ended. And yet, up on the hill above the Snowline, something impossible was happening. A curved metal hut, thin as a tin can, ribbed like the hull of a ship, sat elevated on wooden stilts, swaying slightly in the wind. There was nothing underneath it. No foundation, no stone base, no earthen berm for insulation. Just open air, packed snow, and 40-foot gusts cutting through the valley. By every principle the settlers knew about winter survival, that structure should have been a death trap. It wasn't. Oral account from neighbors describe walking up to check on the man who built it, expecting to find him frozen or at least desperate, and instead finding him in shirt sleeves, a single small stove burning low, a kettle whistling. The interior, they said, was warmer than the church. Warmer than cabins with twice the wood burning twice as hard. No one understood it. A few called it luck. One local record describes a settler referring to the elevated hut as that fool's tin coffin. Another account, collected years later, recalls a neighbor admitting quietly, "We never asked how he did it. We were too proud." And then the next winter came, and we still didn't ask. What he had done was not luck. It wasn't instinct either. It was a decision, one specific, deliberate, quietly radical decision about where a structure meets the ground. Or in this case, where it doesn't. The metal, the arch, the stilts, the snow, they were all part of a system he had assembled from observation, not from any manual. And it worked with a consistency that would have embarrassed the most experienced builders of his time. If you've ever wondered why some structures survive brutal winters while others fail with every advantage, stick around. This one will change how you think about heat, geometry, and the ground beneath your feet. And before we go further, if you find this kind of history worth preserving, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether it's Montana, Manitoba, or somewhere the winters bite just as hard, we want to know. To understand why the neighbors laughed, you have to understand what metal does in the cold. Stone holds heat. Timber slows its passage. Earth swallows it and gives it back slowly, like a battery discharging across a long winter night. These were the materials the frontier understood. These were the materials that had carried people through the worst seasons on record. Not because settlers were sentimental about them, but because they worked. Every log cabin, every sod house, every dugout carved into a hillside was built on the same foundational principle. Mass absorbs heat, and mass releases it slowly. The thicker the wall, the longer the warmth lingers. That was the logic of survival. Metal operates by an entirely different law. Steel and corrugated iron, the materials that made the Quonset hut what it was, are thermal conductors of the highest order. Where a 12-inch log wall might slow heat transfer to a crawl, a single sheet of corrugated steel, roughly 0.05 inches thick, offers almost no resistance at all. In engineering terms, the thermal resistance, or R value, of bare corrugated steel is essentially zero. A log wall of equivalent thickness might carry an R value between 8 and 12. The steel skin of a Quonset hut, uninsulated, sits closer to R 0.5. It is, thermally speaking, barely a barrier at all. And the Quonset hut was designed knowing this. The structure was originally developed during the Second World War to solve a specific military problem: rapid deployment. It needed to be light enough to ship in pieces, simple enough for unskilled labor to assemble in hours, and durable enough to survive wind and rain on temporary bases across the Pacific and European theaters. Warmth was a secondary concern. In the South Pacific, that was fine. On the Alaskan frontier or the northern Great Plains, it was a different calculation entirely. Veterans who brought Quonsets home after the war, and thousands did, purchasing surplus units from government sales at a fraction of their original cost, often reported the same experience. The huts were brutally cold. Local accounts describe interiors dropping to within a few degrees of outdoor temperatures within hours of a fire dying out. One period record from a northern homestead describes a family waking to find the inside walls glazed with ice. Not frost, but a full sheet of ice, after a single cold night without continuous heating. The steel skin had radiated every calorie of warmth directly into the night air by 3 a.m. So the prospect of taking one of these structures and raising it on tall stilts, removing the thermal buffer of the earth beneath it, lifting it into the wind, seemed, to every experienced builder who heard about it, like a willful act of self-destruction. What no one was calculating in those early objections was the other side of the equation. Because steel doesn't just lose heat fast, it also gains it fast. It responds to a heat source with a sensitivity that heavier materials cannot match. While a stone wall takes hours to absorb enough energy to begin radiating warmth back into a room, a steel skin heated from the inside begins reflecting radiant heat within minutes. The lag is nearly zero. The feedback is nearly immediate, in the right geometry. And this is the word that matters. Steel doesn't fight heat. It redirects it. But geometry was exactly what most veterans and settlers weren't thinking about when they cursed their freezing Quonsets and piled on more wood. They were thinking about the stove. They were thinking about the fuel. They were not thinking about the shape of the room around them or the shape of the sky beneath them. The man on the hill was thinking about exactly that. He had watched 2 winters pass before he broke ground, or rather, before he drove his first post into the frozen earth. He had watched where the cold came from. Not the sky, not the wind. Something lower, slower, and far more persistent. And when he finally raised his Quonset above it, the neighbors saw only a fool with a tin hut on stilts. They did not see what he had understood about the ground. His name, according to a veiled reference in what appears to be a regional homesteading ledger from the early post-war years, was something close to Edvard Brol, a name that suggests Scandinavian roots, possibly Norwegian or Swedish, though oral accounts from the area offer no further confirmation. What the same accounts do confirm is that he was not a builder by trade. He was, by most descriptions, a careful observer. He had come to the valley after the war with a surplus Quonset unit, a small amount of savings, and what neighbors later described as an unusual habit. He didn't start building immediately. While others who arrived the same season began clearing timber, laying foundations, and framing walls before the first frost, Edvard spent his first autumn watching. He walked the land in the morning when the mist settled. He walked it again at dusk when the cold dropped fast. He noted which hollows held frost longest into the day. He noted where the snow crusted first after a thaw and where it stayed loose. He was, in the language of the frontier, reading the land, but he was reading it for something more specific than most. He was reading it for cold. What he was observing, without the vocabulary of modern thermodynamics, was a phenomenon that physicists would later describe as cold pooling and ground-level thermal stratification. Cold air is denser than warm air. On still nights, it flows downhill and collects at the lowest points of a landscape, filling valleys and low ground the way water fills a basin. It also radiates upward from the frozen ground itself, creating a layer of intense cold that hugs the earth to a height of roughly 3 to 6 feet in calm conditions, and higher in wind. Edvard had not read about this in any manual, but he had slept outdoors enough and observed enough frost patterns to know it was real. He had noticed that the coldest air wasn't falling from above. It was rising from below, from the ground that had spent all autumn losing its stored summer warmth into the sky and was now a reservoir of cold in its own right. This is the insight that separated him from every neighbor who scoffed. When he chose the site for his Quonset, he chose the highest accessible ground on his claim. Not for the view and not for the drainage, but for the air. High ground drains cold air the same way it drains water. It doesn't hold the pooling. The frost comes later, leaves earlier. The ground-level cold layer is thinner and less stable. He was positioning himself, in the most literal sense, above the worst of it. Then he drove his posts. The stilts he built were not improvised. Oral accounts suggest he spent considerable time selecting the timber for them. Straight-grained fir or larch, accounts differ, and treating the bases with a coal tar compound he had sourced from a railway supplier. He set them 5 feet deep and let them cure through a full freeze-thaw cycle before he trusted them with the weight of the hut. The elevation he settled on was approximately 4 feet from the frozen ground surface to the underside of the Quonset's floor, high enough to clear the deepest snow accumulation he had recorded in his observation year, with roughly 14 to 18 inches of clearance above the expected snowpack at midwinter. When the hut went up on its posts, the reaction from neighboring homesteads was swift and largely derisive. A structure with no foundation, no earth in contact, no sod berm, no banked snow, no buried perimeter. Just a tin shell on wooden legs, open to the wind from every direction below. One account, passed down through a family that had a claim on the adjacent parcel, describes the general sentiment plainly. They figured he'd be gone by February, either to the church in town or back to wherever he had come from. What none of them had factored in was what Edvard had spent 2 winters learning about the air between the ground and the sky, and what he intended to do with it. There's a kind of cold that most people never think about because it doesn't announce itself the way wind does. It doesn't howl. It doesn't blow through gaps in the chinking or rattle the door on its hinges. It seeps. It conducts. It moves through solid material with patience and consistency, pulling heat downward through floors, through foundations, through the soles of boots pressed to frozen earth for too long. It is, in the physics of winter survival, among the most persistent and least discussed enemies a structure faces. Is ground cold, and it killed more fires, wasted more fuel, and drove more homesteaders to despair than any blizzard on record. To understand why, consider what the frozen ground actually is in terms of thermal behavior. Soil, depending on its composition, has a thermal conductivity somewhere between 0.3 and 2.5 watts per meter per degree, a range that sounds technical until you translate it into practical terms. In practical terms, it means that a frozen earth floor or a stone foundation sitting on frozen ground is not a neutral surface. It is an active drain. It pulls heat from whatever sits on top of it, continuously and without interruption, as long as there is a temperature difference between the interior and the frozen mass below. A standard packed earth floor inside a frontier cabin sitting at 55 degrees Fahrenheit indoors, over ground frozen to 20 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 12 inches, is losing heat downward at a rate that a single hearth fire can barely compensate for. The homesteader feels this as a persistent chill at ankle height. He feeds more wood to the fire. The fire warms the air near the ceiling. The cold ground pulls that warm air down again. It is a loop, a losing loop that consumes wood and produces discomfort in roughly equal measure. Stone foundations offered only marginal improvement. A stone foundation can store heat during the day, but it first has to absorb enough heat from the interior to overcome its own cold mass before it begins to help rather than hinder. In the first hours after lighting a fire in a cold cabin with a stone foundation, the foundation itself acts as a heat sink, drawing energy out of the room before it can ever radiate any back. In the depths of a northern winter, with outdoor temperatures at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, that initial thermal debt could take hours to repay. Hours of burning would just to get the structure to neutral. Sod houses and dugouts managed this problem differently. By burying themselves into the earth, they traded the frozen surface ground for the more stable thermal mass of deep soil, which at depths of 4 to 6 feet typically holds temperatures between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. This was genuine vernacular engineering, using the Earth's own thermal inertia as a buffer. It worked well, but it came with costs, moisture, darkness, limited ventilation, and the permanent modification of the landscape. Edvard's approach was neither stone foundation nor buried floor. It was removal. By elevating his Quonset hut 4 feet above the ground surface, he did something that no amount of insulation under a floor could fully replicate. He severed the conductive link between his living space and the frozen earth entirely. There was no foundation of heat before the room could be warm. There was no floor slab drinking cold upward through its mass. There was air between the structure and the ground, and air, even cold air, is a dramatically poorer thermal conductor than soil, stone, or compacted earth. The R value of a 4-foot air gap, accounting for convective movement within it, is not fixed, but in calm conditions, still air provides an insulating value of roughly R1 per inch. Even accounting for wind movement and the loss of the still air advantage in exposed conditions, the thermal barrier provided by that gap was measurably superior to a conventional foundation resting on frozen soil. But Edvard had not accounted for everything. There was one more element in that gap between the stilts, one that would prove to be as important as anything he had deliberately engineered. And it arrived quietly and without invitation, with the first heavy snow of December. Walk into a room with square corners and a flat ceiling on a cold night, and you will feel the failure of its geometry before you understand it intellectually. The warmest air in the room, the air that has risen from the stove or hearth, light and buoyant with heat, collects at the ceiling, pressed into the 4 upper corners where it stagnates. It does not circulate. It sits there, warming the ceiling joists and the space no one occupies, while the floor remains cold and the occupants, living in the lower half of the room, feel the asymmetry on their feet and ankles. This is not a flaw in any particular cabin design. It is a consequence of rectangular geometry interacting with the physics of convection. Warm air rises because it is less dense than the cooler air around it. When it hits a flat ceiling, it spreads outward and fills the upper corners. To come back down, to complete the convective loop that would actually distribute heat through the room, it needs to cool, contract, and descend along the walls. In a square room, it does this awkwardly, pooling in corners, descending unevenly, often creating cold zones near exterior walls and warm zones near the center at ceiling height. The result is a room that is simultaneously too warm, where heat is not needed, and too cool, where people actually live. The Quonset arch solves this problem without a single moving part. The semicircular cross-section of the Quonset hut creates what engineers would recognize as a natural convective loop, a continuous, self-reinforcing circulation of air driven purely by temperature differences and the shape of the enclosing surface. Here is how it works in plain terms. Heat rises from the stove at the center of the hut. It rises toward the apex of the arch, the highest point of the interior. But unlike a flat ceiling, the arch offers no corners for the warm air to stagnate in. The curved surface guides the air smoothly along the interior walls as it cools, directing it back down toward the floor in a steady, even descent along the full length of the hut sides. The air returns to the stove, warms again, and rises once more. The loop is continuous. It is quiet, and it is geometrically enforced, not dependent on the homesteader managing dampers or repositioning furniture or banking the fire at a precise angle. In a conventional rectangular cabin of equivalent floor area, oral accounts and period records suggest that a settler might maintain a floor-level temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, while burning wood continuously, with ceiling temperatures near 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a differential of 15 to 25 degrees between where the heat was and where the people were. In Edvard's Quonset, the arch's convective loop worked to equalize this differential dramatically. Accounts describe the temperature at floor level as notably consistent with the temperature at shoulder height, a convergence that reduced the perception of cold at foot level and made a lower overall fire intensity feel adequate. There was also the matter of radiant heat from the steel skin itself. Steel, as noted earlier, has a thermal conductivity that works against retention in uninsulated conditions. But Edvard had insulated his hut, not with commercial batting, which was expensive and scarce, but with layered wool felt salvage from military surplus and packed tightly between a secondary interior lining of thin wooden boards and the corrugated steel outer shell. This sandwich, steel, air gap, felt, board, was crude by modern standards, but it transformed the thermal behavior of the outer shell from an active radiator of indoor heat to a surface that retained warmth and re-emitted it slowly back into the interior. The arch, now insulated, became a radiant ceiling that curved around the occupants on all sides. The geometry was not incidental. A curved surface that surrounds an occupant on three sides, floor, two arcing walls, and the ceiling that connects them, delivers radiant heat from multiple angles simultaneously. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a different thermal experience than standing in a box. Modern building science has a term for what the arch was doing. It was acting as a radiant enclosure. The more complete the enclosure, the more surface area surrounding the occupant that is warm, the more effective the radiant heat transfer, even at lower absolute temperatures. Edvard did not know the term, but he had felt the difference the first time he sat inside his hut with the stove at half capacity and realized, with some surprise, that he was not cold. He was, for the first time in several winters on that land, genuinely warm, in a tin can on stilts in the worst month of the year. And he still had not accounted for what was happening beneath his feet. No one planned it. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened beneath Edvard's hut in the first weeks of December. He had elevated the structure for one reason: to sever the conductive link between his living floor and the frozen ground. He had thought about the air gap as a thermal break, a passive barrier between two hostile surfaces. He had not thought about what would accumulate in that gap once the season turned serious. He had not thought about what deep, wind-driven snow does when it encounters a raised platform in the middle of an open field on a hillside above a valley. It fills in around the base. This is not a complex phenomenon. It is the same principle that causes snow to drift against fence posts, barn walls, and any vertical surface that interrupts wind flow. The stilts of Edvard's Quonset created a forest of vertical obstructions at ground level. The wind, which carried fine powdered snow in horizontal sheets across the hillside, hit those obstructions and slowed. When wind slows, it drops its load. Snow accumulated against each stilt in a wedge shape, and those wedges grew and merged across the first 2 weeks of December until the entire underside of the Quonset, the full 4-foot gap between frozen ground and insulated floor, was surrounded on all four sides by a continuous berm of packed snow rising from the ground to within roughly 8 to 10 inches of the floor's underside. Edvard noticed it gradually. He did not remove it. What he observed, over the following days, was that the draft he had felt coming up through the floorboards, the cold air movement that had been the one persistent discomfort since he moved in, had nearly stopped. What had happened, without any deliberate engineering on his part, was the formation of what modern passive house designers would recognize as a skirting buffer, an insulating perimeter that enclosed the air gap beneath the structure and transformed it from a ventilated, wind-scoured void into a relatively still, enclosed pocket of air. And still air, unlike moving air, insulates. The R value of that trapped air column, roughly 4 feet deep, enclosed on all sides by packed snow, was now functioning not as a cold sink, but as a thermal buffer between the frozen earth and the floor above. Packed snow, counterintuitively, is not a poor insulator. Its thermal conductivity depends heavily on density, but for naturally wind-packed snow at the densities typical of a drifted berm, roughly 15 to 25 pounds per cubic foot, conductivity values fall in a range that makes it a reasonable insulating material. The Inuit had understood this for centuries. The igloo is not warm because of its shape alone, but because snow, properly packed, slows heat transfer dramatically compared to open air in a polar wind. Edvard was benefiting from the same principle, applied inadvertently to the perimeter of his raised hut. The combined effect was layered. Below the floor, a trapped air column, now sheltered from wind by a snow berm. Below that air column, the frozen ground, now separated from the structure by 4 feet of still air and a 3 to 4 foot deep wall of packed snow. Above the floor, the arch, circulating warm air in a continuous convective loop, with an insulated steel skin re-radiating heat back into the interior. It was, in the most literal sense, a system. Not a system anyone had designed from the top down, but a system nonetheless, assembled from deliberate choices, lucky accumulations, and in different physics of cold air, warm air, and the geometry that separated them. Oral accounts suggest that Edvard became aware of the snow skirt's importance sometime in mid-December, when a week of warmer weather caused partial melting and the draft returned briefly through the floor. He rebuilt the berm by hand, packing snow against the stilts and along the perimeter with a wooden shovel, and noted afterward that the interior recovered its warmth within a shorter time than he had expected. He began maintaining the berm as a deliberate feature, packing and compressing it after each major snowfall to maximize its density and continuity. By January, it was no longer an accident. It was part of his winter routine. Every morning, a circuit of the perimeter with the shovel, checking for gaps, filling wind erosion on the exposed south and west faces, compressing any fresh, loose powder into the denser mass below. 15 minutes of work. In exchange, a floor that held its warmth through the night. A stove that burned at a level most of his neighbors would have considered dangerously low for the temperatures outside. He had not invented the snow skirt. He had not named it. He had only noticed it, understood it, and refused to clear it away. That refusal, unremarkable as it sounds, was its own kind of engineering. The storm came in the third week of January, and it came without much warning. Temperatures had been dropping for 6 days before the wind arrived. A slow, grinding descent from the seasonal average of -8 degrees Fahrenheit down through -19 degrees Fahrenheit, -24 degrees Fahrenheit, touching -31 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of the 17th. Before the pressure system that had been building over the northern plains finally broke loose and drove a 4-day blizzard across the valley with sustained winds between 35 and 45 miles per hour in gusts recorded by a weather observer in the nearest town at 61 miles per hour. By the end of the first day, 2 cabins on the lower ground had lost their stovepipes to the wind. A third, a well-built log structure belonging to an experienced homesteader, had its roof partially compromised by drifting, snow packing into a gap in the ridge beam and pressing down on the interior ceiling until the boards bowed visibly. Families gathered in whatever structure offered the most shelter. The church in town, a timber frame building on a stone foundation, burned wood continuously for 4 days and maintained an interior temperature that one account describes as barely above freezing near the floor, warm enough near the ceiling to be bearable. On the hill above the snowline, Edvard's Quonset hut bent in the wind, but did not fail. The arch worked in his favor structurally, as well as thermally. The semicircular profile presents no flat face to the wind, no surface for pressure to build against in the way it does on a vertical wall. Wind flows around and over the curved shell the way water flows around a stone in a stream, with less turbulence and less structural loading than a rectangular building of equivalent floor area would have experienced. The corrugated steel skin flexed slightly in the strongest gusts. Witnesses described a low metallic groan during the peak of the storm, but the ribs held. The stilts, set 5 feet deep into the frozen ground and braced with diagonal timber struts Edvard had added in November after noticing the structure sway during an early season windstorm, did not move. Inside, by Edvard's own account, recorded years later in a brief written recollection discovered in a regional archive, the stove ran at what he described as moderate draw throughout the storm. He fed it roughly every 4 to 5 hours during the day and banked it at night, as was his habit. The interior temperature, which he tracked with a simple spirit thermometer mounted on the interior wall at standing height, ranged between 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the 4 days of the storm. Outside, the low temperature during the same period reached -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential between 61 degrees Fahrenheit inside and -36 degrees Fahrenheit outside represents a span of 97 degrees maintained by a single small stove running at moderate capacity in an uninsulated by modern standards metal structure on stilts. For context, a well-chinked log cabin of equivalent floor area burning would continuously during the same storm was described in a neighboring account as holding somewhere above 45 degrees Fahrenheit near the stove, much colder away from it. The fuel consumption in that cabin, by the same account, was approximately twice what Edvard used over the same period. The numbers are worth sitting with. Same storm, same hillside, roughly equivalent floor area. One structure using twice the wood to maintain a lower and less consistent temperature. The other, the tin hut on stilts, the fool's tin coffin, using half the fuel to hold a range that one account describes as warm enough to work without a coat near the stove. The reason was not magic, and it was not luck. It was the accumulation of every principle Edvard had assembled, deliberately or otherwise, over 2 years of observation and 1 season of occupation. The severed ground contact, the still air in the snow-skirted gap below, the convective loop enforced by the arch above, the insulated steel skin re-radiating warmth from every curved surface simultaneously. Each element was modest on its own. Together, they compounded. After the storm broke, a few neighbors made the walk up the hill. The accounts of those visits are brief and, characteristically for the period, understated. One man, a Finnish homesteader named Maki, whose cabin had burned through 3 times the wood Edvard had used, reportedly stood in the doorway of the Quonset for a long moment without speaking. Then he asked how the stilts were set and how deep the posts went. He did not ask why the hut was warm, but he had stopped thinking of it as a coffin. There is a quiet irony in the way the Quonset hut faded from serious architectural consideration in the decades following the Second World War. The structure had proven itself under conditions that would have humbled far more celebrated building traditions. It had survived blizzards on the Aleutian Islands, monsoon seasons in the South Pacific, the freeze-thaw extremes of northern homestead winters, and the mechanical stresses of rapid assembly and disassembly under field conditions. It was by almost any engineering measure relevant to frontier survival, an exceptional form. And yet, by the mid-1950s, it had been largely relegated to the category of temporary structure, a wartime expedient, useful in emergencies, unsuitable for permanent habitation, something to be replaced as soon as a proper house could be built. The reasons for this dismissal were partly aesthetic and partly cultural. The post-war housing boom in the United States was oriented almost entirely toward the suburban lot, the poured concrete foundation, the balloon frame wall, and the pitched roof. These were the forms that prosperity was supposed to look like. A curved metal shell on stilts looked like poverty, or like war, or like a man who hadn't figured things out yet. The visual language of the arch was the wrong language for the moment. But the thermal logic of the arch, the convective loop, the radiant enclosure, the geometrically enforced air circulation, did not become less true because fashion moved on. It remained embedded in the physics of the structure, waiting for the people who would eventually rediscover it. They are rediscovering it now. Across the off-grid and passive building communities of North America and Northern Europe, the last 2 decades have produced a quiet resurgence of interest in arched and vaulted interior forms specifically for their thermal behavior. Earthship builders have long favored curved, south-facing walls that function as radiant thermal masses. Monolithic dome builders cite the convective efficiency of the hemisphere as a primary design advantage. Passive house consultants increasingly flag the corner and flat ceiling combination of conventional rectangular rooms as a source of thermal stratification that their designs work to minimize. What these modern practitioners are articulating in the language of energy modeling and computational fluid dynamics, Edvard Brull understood through observation in a winter in a tin hut on a hill. The comparison to modern construction is not flattering to the present. A standard residential home built in the northern United States today, with a poured concrete slab or a basement resting on frozen ground contacting footings, rectangular rooms with flat ceilings, forced air heating that dumps warmth at ceiling level and draws cold air back through floor-level returns, makes many of the same thermal errors that Edvard's neighbors made in the 1940s. It heats the wrong air in the wrong place, fighting geometry rather than using it. It sits on the cold ground rather than above it. It moves heat by forced convection through a duct system that loses between 20% and 30% of its energy to leakage and conduction before the air ever reaches the room it was meant to warm. It is, in many of the ways that matter to the physics of winter survival, less efficient than a tin hut on stilts with a snow skirt and a wood stove. That is not a comfortable conclusion for an industry that has spent 80 years congratulating itself on progress. But it is the conclusion that the physics supports. The lessons Edvard left, not in any manual, not in any lecture, but in the structure he built and maintained and lived in through winters that defeated better appointed neighbors, are not antiques. They are not curiosities for historians of frontier life. They are operational principles for anyone who intends to heat a space with less fuel, more comfort, and more intelligence than the standard approach currently provides. Elevate the floor above the cold ground. Enclose the gap with whatever the environment offers. Use the arch to let warm air find its own way around the room. Insulate the outer shell enough to make it a radiator rather than a drain. And pay attention, the way Ed Vard paid attention, to what the cold is doing before you decide where to put your walls. The arch has not forgotten any of this. It never does. It is the builders who forget. And every brutal winter is an invitation to remember. This content is produced for historical and educational purposes only. It does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.